Okie dokie, I've got the thumbs up, so here we go. Welcome everyone to the WSET School's webinar called Discovering Baijiu. Now, I'm a late substitution, hence the slightly kind of ramshackle appearance of like shutters and all sorts of things. The WSET colleague who should have been there has unfortunately had to step out. But fear not, because it's my job to deal with spirits. I deal with all of the spirits qualifications at WSET and was the author of the new level 3 spirits book. So I come here with hopefully reasonable kind of information with which we're going to be able to dig into Baijiu. But that's me. Now let's just introduce here now also Derek. So Derek Sandhaus is, I think without question, the preeminent authority on Baijiu in the English speaking world. He is the founder and co-owner of Ming River. That's right, isn't it, Derek?
Yeah, so I'm one of 4 co-founders of Ming River Baijiu. Yeah,
which is a delicious baijiu, I have to say.
thank you.
And your website is drinkbaijiu.com. And also, you've recently you've got a new book out, which is Drunk in China, which has been nominated for, is in the top 10 for the Tales category, which is up against our level 3 book. So that'll be a little bit of a bit of a fun. They haven't announced the short list yet. That was supposed to be announced on Monday, well, but they delayed that, I think, quite appropriately.
My fingers are crossed that we both make it to the short list.
Yes, it would be good to kind of have that, because it will be 2 books, because I mean our book goes into Baijiu into quite a bit of detail as well. So okay, so welcome one and all. Now I've been asked to kind of do a quick bit of housekeeping. So this is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube, on the WSET's YouTube channel, and it will also be available through, you can click through to it via the WSET London School website. And if you'd like to, this is going to be quite a complex subject. We're going to try and get through this as clearly as we can, but we absolutely appreciate there are going to be questions here. So if you do have questions, please put them in the chat, sort of share it to everyone. And then we've got some colleagues kind of lurking in the background. They'll curate those questions and we'll try and deal with them all at the end. It's potentially very likely that you might be kind of going through the process and we will kind of be describing something and you'll go, oh, but I don't get this. And it actually might be coming up later. So I think we feel it's going to be hopefully easy to do them at the end. So that's that little bit done. Now, what we're trying to do today is we're trying to look at and explain some of the processes that, and there's only some of them, some of the processes that are involved in Baijiu manufacture and how it's made. The similarities and differences with what we've got in maybe some spirits that maybe you're more familiar with in the kind of broadly Western European tradition. And also we'd be really interesting to hear, Derek, on the styles of the Baijiu and the kind of what kind of the taste that we're going to get in these things. And as we go through, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a malt Scotch whiskey as a comparative example, just so it kind of helps us see where some of the similarities and differences are. Because actually, although there are very obvious differences, the similarities I think are as significant. So without any further ado, I'm just going to ask Derek first. I'm going to ask him into this. First question: how long has distilling been going on in China? So, kind of, what's the kind of the broad history of Baijiu?
Well, that's an interesting question. So, China has, broadly speaking, been making some form of alcohol intentionally for we know of at least 9,000 years.
Oh, good Lord! I didn't realize. Yeah, no.
Yeah, so it's the oldest known location of alcohol production anywhere in the world. But for most of that history, they were working first with like very basic wines and beers and meads or combinations of those things. And then starting around 2000, 1000 BC, they started making fermented beverages that were using what's called Chu, which we'll get into later, but roughly speaking is a natural culture of microorganisms.
Absolutely.
And then, that drink became something that we call Huangzhou, or yellow alcohol, which was the dominant drink for most of Chinese history. And then There are some people who look at archaeological evidence and think that China was distilling alcohol several thousand years ago. I don't find that particularly convincing. I think the first definitive evidence we have that spirits were distilled in China comes from about 800 to 1,000 years ago during the Song and Yuan dynasties in China.
Okay.
And the reason that we think that that's when it happened is because during the Song dynasty, they were already distilling alcohol in parts of the Middle East and Europe, and
Absolutely,
China
yeah.
had trade routes with that part of the world. And if not then the Yuan dynasty was the Mongolian conquest of China. And the Mongols conquered Central Asia, they conquered the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And distilled spirits were definitely a part of their empire. So that is the latest possible time that spirits could have entered China.
Okay, great. Now, Baijiu is, I think I haven't got the figures. I haven't been able to check the figures because I was a late substitution here, but I'm pretty certain that Baijiu is still the largest spirits category in the world. Is that still right? Is that still true? It is enormous in its scale.
So right now, the amount of Baijiu that's distilled in China has contracted a bit in the last several years for a number of reasons, but they still produce about 8 billion liters of Baijiu every single year, which is just an extraordinary amount of liquor. It's more than whiskey, vodka, and a few other spirits combined. So just tremendously huge in terms of its global importance to the spirits industry.
But we don't really see, I mean, exports are modest in terms of the total percentage still, aren't they? Just as a percent, I mean, how much as a percentage is leaving China? I mean, is it kind of like single digits?
I would say it's less than 1%. It might be less than 0.1%.
Okay, wow. So
all of the Baijiu that's produced in China is consumed in China.
Thirsty people. So that kind of hopefully gives us a little bit of some context to Baijiu. So what we're going to do is we're going to jump into looking through these steps of production, and the way that I like to frame this, or we like to frame this here at WSET anyway, is to kind of start with the raw material, and then there are some very predictable things that have got to happen. We've got to make something fermentable. We've got to get something fermentable from the raw material. We've then got to ferment it. We've got to make alcohol, distill it, and then we can do something with that afterwards. And the reason I chose as a comparison a malt whiskey is because Baijiu is mostly made. Well, it's made from grains. It's a grain thing, and all grains store their energy as starch. And starch is quite a tricky thing to get to a fermentable substrate from. You've got to do stuff to it. And to cut a very complicated story short, the basic things you need are heat to kind of make it more available and soluble. Then you need enzymes to kind of snip it up and break it apart. And then gives you sugar. And then you're going to need yeast to make the alcohol. Now, as we go through looking at the malt whiskey and the Baijiu, they're skinning this particular problem. That was a horrible mixed metaphor, but they're solving these challenges. It's the same challenge, they're just doing it slightly differently. But just bear that as context as we go through this. But first of all, the raw material. So Derek, I've said it's grains, but what kind of grains are used, and what kind of flavors do they bring to the party? What kind of are we actually tasting these grains when we taste Baijiu?
Yes, certainly you are tasting the grains. In some ways, they have an impact on the final product. But it should be said right up front at the beginning of this talk that when we're talking about Baijiu, we're not talking about just one specific type of liquor. We're talking about a family of spirits. So most of those styles of Baijiu, and there are, I think, 12 officially recognized styles, most of those styles are going to be made with sorghum, which is a grain it's tall, stocky, has hard kernels. It's very similar to corn in terms of what kind of flavor it brings to the table. It's got a lot of starch and it does very well in dry environments. Sorghum is the most the primary ingredient for making baijiu, but you can make it really with any type of grain. So rice is probably the next most popular. And then after that, you have multi-grain baijius that use a mash that has sorghum, wheat, corn, and rice, usually in that combination mixed together. So, but there are baijius that are made from barley. There are baijius that are made from millet and Job's tears and all sorts of grains that aren't particularly common in European winemaking.
Okay. Now I'm still relatively new into this category, the availability of obviously baijiu isn't massive, and you've had a whole lot more. When you're tasting these, are you definitely, and this is something that I'm really looking forward to kind of being able to do, but are you tasting when you go through them, you're going, that's clearly got some barley in it, that's clearly sorghum, this is maybe more rice based. I mean, there could be other stylistic factors that can kind of give you those hints, but is it as, because I know when you can say, for example, having American whiskies and you say having a bourbon, and you can go, this is, you can really feel the rye kind of content in this. Do you have similar kind of experiences when you're kind of tasting through baijiu?
Well, I think when you're drinking rice-based baijius, you can definitely taste the rice. You get a very similar flavor profile to sake or a Korean soju. But with sorghum, one of the issues with it is sorghum's not found in a lot of food products in China or elsewhere. So most people outside of Africa, where it comes from, don't really recognize the taste of sorghum in their spirit. So I would say the flavor that it contributes is definitely a cereal spirit. It's detectable as such, but it tends to be on the sweeter side of things because it is so rich in starch.
Okay. Great. All right. Now we're going to move on to the into the areas where we have our similarities and differences. So, what I'm just as a very rapid summary, if I'm making my malt whiskey, and again, I'm using this as a convenient example, and malt whiskey is one type of many whiskeys. So again, as Derek was saying, there are many different types of baijiu. So these are just examples to help us understand. So if I'm making a malt whiskey, I'm going to malt the barley. I'm then going to mill the barley, and then we're going to mash it. Now, during the malting process, we've created enzymes, which we need to snip up starch. And in the mashing, we've kind of we've made the starch available for the snipping to happen. So when the mashing is completed, we've got a liquid, which is really very sweet, surprisingly so, to which they'll add yeast and they'll make alcohol. So these things are happening in a one after the other, after the other, after the other. Other things, which I think, just for context, most whiskies fermented in vats. Some of them are open vats. The fermentation are kind of measured in days rather than, days and that many days, really. And the distiller would pretty much want to use up all the starch. So once we've got the starch in there and it's being fermented, all of that starch is going to be used up. So that's kind of a very European perspective. So if we kind of flip over into China, we need enzymes and we need yeast, and they come from a really different source, and this source is called Chu. So Derek, can you give us a little understanding of what is Chu? Because this is the thing that makes all the magic happen, isn't it?
So in its most simple form, what Chu is, it's a grain that's been processed with water in some way, turned into a paste, and then that paste is formed into some solid mass. So with rice, which was what they call small Chu, usually you form that into a little ball, and they look like little tiny white balls. And with wheat-based, which is what you use for most sorghum-based baijius, what they call big Chu, you're going to form that paste into a brick. And then you will take the Chu and you'll put it in a controlled environment, usually a room that's kind of temperature controlled in some ways. They'll make sure sunlight is either coming in or not based on what part of the process you're looking at. And what happens is over the period of a few weeks, usually, the grains will start decomposing and all of the microorganisms that live in the air will begin forming within the Chu. So principally what we're talking about forming in this chew is three things. In greatest abundance, you have mold, then you have yeast, and then you have bacteria. So what you have there is the basic, like the beginnings of a fermentation that's taking place within that block. But then you can dry the chew out in the sun and it will stop the grains from further decomposing. And all of those chemical processes will essentially be frozen within that block. So if you mix the chew together, usually it's pulverized into a powder. If you mix that together with a steamed grain, then the chew will begin to exert those chemical processes on the grain. So essentially what happens is you steam the grain. Let's say we're working with sorghum. You steam the grain, and what the steam does is it begins to break down the cell walls of that grain to make it easier for chemical interactions to happen. Then the mold that's within the chew, it will begin sprouting and forming these enzymes that will convert the starches into sugar. The yeast in the chew, at the same time that this sugar is forming, will begin converting that into alcohol within the grain. So, and then the bacteria, of course, will interact with the alcohol and will start forming flavor compounds like esters and aldehydes and things of that sort. So you've got everything you need, both from like a flavor perspective and a fermentation, saccharification perspective within that chew. So it's really unusual compared to a whiskey, I would say, in three important ways. The first being that you are performing the conversions of starches into sugar and sugar into alcohol at the same time, which are two separate steps in the European tradition.
Exactly.
The second thing that's very different is that you're actually creating a solid mash rather than a liquid mash. You're creating a solid clump of grains that has alcohol within it, but has very little liquid within it. And then the final way that it's different is that because you're not, getting yeast or any of these enzymes from, external sources, all of this is coming from the location of and the air around the distillery. So the flavor of your Baijiu is going to be entirely dependent on the microclimate of wherever you're performing the fermentation and distillation. And that will influence the flavor in a lot of interesting.
I think that's a really important that actually these are spirits of a place in an actually a very, very meaningful way, because I'm kind of expand or and do a ferment exactly the same way using exactly the same recipe, do it somewhere else, and they just haven't been able, despite all their efforts, to get the right kind of microorganisms kind of ambient in the environment, and they just haven't been able to recreate the style they want. I think is that an urban myth, or is that actually true?
No, that's actually true. There's actually a very famous brand in China that I'm sure anyone who has read anything about Baijiu knows, Guizhou Maotai, which is
yes, it's huge, and it's delicious.
A sauce aroma style Baijiu. And in the 1970s, they wanted to expand the distillery because it's in a very kind of space-limited environment. It's literally located right next to a river and a mountain, so there's very little room for them to expand. So they wanted to build an expansion to the distillery just a couple of kilometers away. And they did everything the same. They took the same process. They took the blueprints from the old distillery and rebuilt it. They even took dust from the ceiling beams at the old distillery and moved them to the new distillery. But after they produced it, aged it, blended it together, they decided that the taste was too different. So that became a different Baijiu distillery that's called Zhenzhou today.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah.
Did that small difference in distance change the final product?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very remarkable fact that those kind of differences exist, and given the propensity for a lot of European distillers to use cultured yeast, particularly, it's not something we necessarily see. But if you wanted a comparison into and I use this in the most general sense, more European Western kind of traditions. If you look at some of the rum fermentations that maybe happen in Jamaica, or some of the mezcal fermentations where they are very reliant on ambient microflora, actually you can't recreate different styles in different places because it is so site specific. Now, one thing I wanted to talk to you about, Derek, was about actually where these fermentations are taking place, because most people are used to sort of seeing a fermentation kind of in a vat, but not all by any stretch of the imagination, but quite a common method of fermenting is in a pit. So kind of what do they kind of, I mean, I suppose a pit is quite straight, it's a hole in the ground, but I mean, how big are they, and kind of, and also how long does a fermentation last for in one of these pits?
Okay, so there's a couple different questions in there. I'll start with fermentation time and the length of fermentation. And this is a key distinction between different styles of Baijiu. So generally speaking, you have time periods that range from like rice-based Baijius are usually the shortest length of fermentation, which will be like a few days to a week or so, how long the fermentation will take place. But you do have more complex Baijius, like strong and sauce aroma Baijius, which will have fermentation periods of anywhere from like 2 to 3 months for strong aroma Baijiu. With sauce aroma Baijiu, you have increasingly long periods of fermentation that go all the way up to about 6 or 7 months, maybe longer than that. So,
I mean, that's hugely different, isn't it?
Yeah, hugely different, and you notice it in the flavor. You get a lot more complexity, and you get like a lot more umami flavors in the spirit from that. So that's one important thing. The other question is about the vessel in which the fermentation is performed. So in traditional Chinese fermentation, in the classic method, you use stone or clay jars to perform the fermentation, where you will basically just put the mash in there. Sometimes you add water, it's been mixed together with Chu, and then you put a lid on it and leave it in there for however long you plan on fermenting it. At the end of the process, if you're just drinking the fermented beverage, you press the liquid out of the mash and you drink it. But what happened with Baijiu is oftentimes you were working with like a great deal of mash, and you would also be trying to produce more product. So there are Baijius that are still fermented in stone jars on a massive scale. But you also start seeing around, 500-600 years ago, people to start performing fermentation in pits, which can fit a lot more grain. In some styles of light aroma Baijiu that use a stone or concrete pits, you have, I would say that they can hold about roughly the amount that goes in a Chinese still, which would be, I'm not entirely sure of the volume, maybe like a ton of grain or something like that.
Okay.
They measure everything in tons in China, but with strong aroma Baijiu, you're actually using a very, very large mud pit in the ground. And that is about 2 to 3 meters deep and can hold about 20 to 30 tons of grain.
Well, I mean, that really is quite a lot, isn't it? Yeah.
It is. And one other thing that's interesting about a couple styles of Baijiu, strong aroma is the most famous for this. That mud pit fermentation is important because the clay is a very absorbent substance. So as you ferment and you continue to use the same pits for fermentation, the walls of the pit will begin absorbing microorganisms and bacteria from the fermentation process. And after a few years of yeast, they begin participating themselves in the fermentation process. So actually developing these pits over years, decades, and in some cases centuries is viewed as essential to the creation of the unique flavors of the product.
I mean, it's certainly one of the things that struck me when I've talked to Yu Chen, who we both know, but other people from China, and just the generational perspective they have on these things. It's like, well, a pit doesn't come into its kind of quality area until it's like 30 or 40 years of use, and then it's at its peak when it's 100 years. So if you're preparing this as a new pit, well, we need to put a new pit in, well, you're not going to see the best of that because you're going to be long gone. It's just an incredible way that they're kind of, that they look at things from in such a kind of a long-term perspective. It must make logistical planning a bit of a nightmare.
It is on the one hand, but I mean, there are ways in which you can create similar, bacterial colonies within your pit. So I've been to distilleries that are much newer, private distilleries that opened in the last 10, 15 years, and they're still in the process of getting those pits where they want them to be. So one thing that they will do is, I think this would be familiar to anyone who studies, Jamaican rums or things like that. They're actually like adding external matter. They'll be adding like banana peels and various things to the mud pit.
Okay. Just to kind of really
try to create more bacteria that's not there naturally yet.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's really interesting because I mean, jackfruit is one of the things they use in Jamaica, which has got certain sort of yeast on its exterior, which are particularly attracted to jackfruit. And that's really interesting. Now, that's fermentation. It's a parallel process. It's in a solid state. It's damp, but it's solid. It's very different. We don't actually get a lot of alcohol necessarily. I mean, it's not, we don't get huge alcohol, but again, I remember you saying previously that it's quite difficult to measure these because we're used to doing it by alcohol by volume. But once you kind of scoop a pit out, you've just got a lump of soggy grains. And so you're kind of looking at almost by alcohol by weight, I think you said.
Yeah, so we think of when we're talking about distillation of a liquid, we know what the strength of that liquid is before it goes in the still, and we know what it is when it comes out of the still. But you are actually transforming the state of this alcohol from you're extracting it from a solid and getting it into a liquid. So they measure alcohol by weight. And I think usually, like for example, Strong Aroma, which is the most familiar to me because it's what Ming River, my company, works with. That starts maybe like 3%, 3.5% alcohol by weight. And then after it comes out of the still, it can be anywhere from like 60 to 70% alcohol by volume. What is interesting though is that you really are, as I was saying, kind of like transforming, like you're moving from like the solid mash to the liquid state. And unlike the Western pot still, which is liquid based, with the Chinese still, you're working with something that's much closer to a like a dim sum dumpling steamer or a vegetable steamer, where you have an open slotted bottom that you stack the grain on top of, and then you place it over a boiling cauldron of water, and the steam actually runs through the mash, heating up the alcohol and vaporizing the alcohol. But as it travels through the mash, it's continually going to be condensing as it hits the cooler grains above it. So you are performing some kind of refraction within this solid
that
allows you to reach much higher levels of alcohol than you would if you were just doing a single pass with a liquid.
Exactly. And I think so the stills that they use, the traditional Baijiu stills, actually are remarkably short. I mean, they're not very tall at all. I think I'm about 6 foot, 2 meters, give or take. So if I was stood next to it, it would kind of come up to about kind of like mid torso height. They're not really that tall at all, are they? And you're going from a very low alcohol to a very, very high alcohol. So if anyone wanted to kind of have an understanding of what the most immediate comparison is, you would need to Google a packed column still. So essentially, although they kind of look like pot stills, they're actually really operating like a packed column. And it's these kind of tiny little areas where you can get condensation and revaporization, condensation, revaporization, which allows you to get in one distillation a liquid which is 70, it's sort of in the 70s, aren't they, typically around that kind of strength?
It can be anywhere from like 50 to 70%, depending
Okay,
on,
I mean that's
how they're
yeah.
doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, that's that. Now there is one other thing, and this is a stroke of genius, I think. So when you start off, when you're going to make it do a fermentation in Baijiu, you need to steam the grains. That's that's the first thing you need to do. And obviously, and you're going to steam distill the mash once it's come out of the fermentation pit. You could have 2 vessels for that, but they don't do that, do they?
No. So the steaming of the grains at the beginning of the process is the same. You're using the still. And the difference between just steaming grains in a Chinese still and distilling fermented grains in a Chinese still is whether or not you put a lid on top of the pot still. So
yeah.
When a distillery is just steaming grains, usually they'll just leave the grains in open-ended and let the steam boil off into the air. But what this allows you to do, and is something that is very exciting about strong aroma Baijiu, is that it allows you to sometimes perform both steaming and distillation at the same time. You can create
genius. I think it's just
circular process. So what we do at our distillery, and is common for all strong aroma Baijius, is you actually, it's a circular process as opposed to a linear process where you will you will ferment the grains, and then you will distill some of the grains and throw them away, and you essentially replace the grains that you've thrown away with fresh grain, mix that together with the mash, and then steam a fresh source of starch for the next round of fermentation while you distill the fermented grains from the previous batch. So with a strong aroma batch, about like 80% of the mash is recycled over and over again from one cycle to the next. And you will be using some form of the same mash essentially forever, for as long as you want to keep that mash and that pit going together.
Yeah. So Lydia, if you can hear me, this probably be a really good time to bring up that second slide, if you could, because then we can sort of show everyone. This is a, if you kind of actually, probably easy because I don't, yeah, that's it, super. So this is a representation of, a very simplified representation of the strong aroma cycle, which is described, I think, sometimes as the eternal cycle, because it's just almost kind of like ongoing. So if we start down at this kind of pit, you can see on the slide, which is on the left-hand side, what happens is it's kind of emptied out into layers. Now, for sake of simplicity, we've done this as 4 layers. The top 2 layers go forward to distillation, and then the next 2 layers, we're introducing fresh grains. So we're just putting steam grains, we're putting those in with the fermented mash, and then they're then ready for distillation. And each of these layers, now this again is a simplification, each of these layers is then distilled separately. And you've probably, and so you get the first spirit come off, then a second spirit, third and fourth. Now, Derek, I'm sure you've probably had some of these kind of spirits from different layers, and how dramatically, I mean, I've never had the opportunity to have that. How dramatically different are they? I'm told that it's quite...
Basically what's going on here is if you're looking at the, like at the bottom of your screen, what you're seeing is like the interior of a pit and these different layers of mash within the pit. So at the top of the pit, you're going to have the driest layer of the mash. So that's not going to have a ton of alcohol in it. It's not going to be particularly flavorful either, but it will contribute some like more like cereally umami flavors. So then down in the bottom layers, at the very lowest layer, you've got the most amount of alcohol, and that's going to have like the richest flavor. And That's so, like, very, very simply put, you're taking the topmost part, distilling it, and then you throw it away. You feed it to pigs,
Yeah.
whatever. And then the rest of the pit, you can do this the way you have here. But I think there's a lot of variation in
Yeah,
the lower
absolutely.
pits and how they're prepared. So, for example, we, like, at our distillery, we probably just add, like, an amount equivalent, like that 20% at the top that you've distilled and thrown away gets mixed in with the lower levels, and they get mixed together and are distilled together. They're not necessarily going to be put back in the pit in the order that they came.
Yeah. Yeah.
Some distilleries do it this way. Some distilleries will even reverse the process and put the grains that were on the top on the bottom.
But okay.
So there's a million different variations, but the point is that you're always injecting a small amount of grain into the cycle every single time, so that you can develop those flavors over a very long period of time. And it's kind of like conceptually like the process of like making a sourdough starter, where you're trying to, continue to use that same bit of mash to, influence the next batch until you get where you want to be over, many months, years, or centuries.
Yeah. And as you say, there's many different variations here, and I think this is a this is a really good way of just kind of very simple way of showing that a lot of the grains that have gone into the still have actually gone through the distillation process and back into the fermentation pit, and we're adding fresh grains in all the time, and so we're always replenishing the starch level. So there's always new fermentable material coming in, and it's just such this is very, very particular, for strong aroma, to have this kind of circularity, this kind of ongoing kind of cycle. And it's so contrasted from the very linear approach that we're very used to in sort of like, we start with the raw material, we go through a batch, something comes out at the end. It's just I think it's a very beautiful way of doing things, but let's not get too kind of like emotional. So thank you, Lydia. If we can take that down. I just want to very quickly touch on thank you very much. Just very quickly touch on post distillation stuff. So back to our whiskey example, well, obviously it's going to be an oak, various kinds of things, and that adds a lot of flavor. It kind of helps to kind of resolve some of the textures, say particularly in American whiskey. What happens to the Baijiu post distillation? Typically, I mean, what are they doing with their spirit once they've got it?
So as you can see, just from like that last diagram, oftentimes you're fermenting more grain in a pit than will easily fit in one still. And many times you've got, many batches that come out of the still. So depending on where they came out of the pit, how old the pit was, what time of year it was produced, each batch that comes out is going to be slightly different in its taste. So they want to preserve those differences, and they do that by storing them separately. And they age Baijiu traditionally and most often in clay jars. And these are usually terracotta clay. And to reduce evaporation, because clay is an incredibly porous substance, they will they'll usually either bury these jars underground, or they'll store them in caves where there's a lot of humidity. So basically what's happening, I would say cheaper Baijiu, you're going to have it aged for a shorter period of time, a few months, maybe half a year. But I would say your mid to upper end Baijius are going to be aged for at least 2 to 3 years in most instances. And what you're happening, you get almost no impact from the clay itself on the spirit. It's a fairly neutral substance, maybe a slight minerality to the final product, but it's almost unnoticeable. What you're doing more is you're allowing the oxygen to enter the spirit from the surrounding air.
And that can come in through the clay.
Yeah, exactly. So it's coming in through the pores of the clay. And what that does, it does two important things. One is it kind of neutralize some of the more like astringent volatile compounds within the spirit so that it becomes smoother and mellower. So it changes the texture a bit. And then you're also adding more oxygen, which is a new chemical compound that will interact with the chemicals already within the spirit. You will further develop esters, you will further develop aldehydes and other congeners that will change the taste of the final product. So
it is absolutely a match, and I think this is an important thing to kind of emphasize, is absolutely a maturation process. There is change that's going on. Although it's not giving color, and it's not actively giving flavor in the way that a wood vessel or an oak vessel would.
Correct.
Excellent. And then obviously when they get to the end, they're going to have lots of different spirits, which they'll then blend. So you'll get the kind of the less expensive ones, which will have kind of maybe younger, from kind of less aromatically intense layers of the pits to the kind of like insanely expensive, some of these, very top end stuff, which is the older spirits with them from the deeper levels of the pit, which have got much more character to them. Okay. So that's taken us, I think, through. Oh, sorry. Was there another?
I should point out that so that the maturation at the end of that process, that would classically be the end of the Baijiu process. 100 years ago, you would just spoon people out, Baijiu from the clay jar and sell it on the market. But today, pretty much all Baijiu in China is going to be blended. And that is why it's so important that all of the spirits that come out of the separate distilled batches, all of the different distillates that have all those different flavors, you kept them separate so that at the end of the process, you can actually blend them together to create more combinations of flavor, more complexity of flavor, and balance them out. Also, with modern products, you have brands and reputations to maintain. So it's very important that you have someone with a very good palate who's your master blender, who can take all of these variations in product and blend them together so that, Ming River in 2018 tastes the same that Ming River tastes like in 2019. And that wouldn't be possible if you didn't blend.
No, absolutely. And it's that kind of slightly counterintuitive reality that for a blender, the more options they have, the easier it is to get to that kind of consistent product. And the other thing is that even some incredibly expensive Baijiu. So I'm just thinking, say, Maltai's higher end expressions, which I think in the European market for quite small bottles are several £100s. So these are produced on very big scales as well, aren't they? So that they're not only creating incredibly valuable product, but actually significant volumes of them as well, which is always something that we don't associate so much in the way you think high value but very low production.
Sure. And when you're talking about, like I mentioned at the beginning, the recorded 8 billion liters of production last year, I would guess the overwhelming majority of that is coming from, I would guess, less than 100 distilleries. The bigger name brand distilleries have enormous operations, and in some cases, operations that pretty much are the biggest business in a city and spread out throughout that city in many different buildings. So it's while the processes themselves are very, what we would think is very like traditional, lots of manual labor, lots of very few artificial, if any, additives of any kind. But the scale is tremendous.
Yeah. I know I've not yet had the opportunity to visit, but I've seen photographs, and it's just like it's truly enormous. Thank you very much. So that's great. We've gone through that, and one of the things I'd just like to maybe conclude with on this bit before we take a few questions is, what are the different? So we've mentioned there are different styles. There are 12 kind of, to a degree, laid down in the Chinese law. There's the 4 main ones, and then there's the 8 kind of much smaller kind of ones. So what are say if we focus on the 4 main ones, what are those 4 main ones, and what kind of flavors would you be looking out for if you were looking at some good examples of those?
Okay, so moving from, let's say, mild to complex, which again is shorter fermentation time to longer fermentation time.
Mm-hmm.
Of the four main styles, rice aroma is the shortest and I would say most approachable, least complex style. You do taste some like notes of toasted rice. That comes through, and I think it reminds me the most of probably like sake or
Mm.
like lower ABV. And this is typically bottled, I would say, in the 30s to 40s. It can be stronger, but people prefer this style to be a bit milder.
Mm-hmm.
And you might get some like honey-like sweetness and also like some like kind of lemon rind like bitterness to it as well, like
Mm-hmm.
sweet notes. Then that comes from southeastern China. And then up north, you have light aroma Baijiu, which comes from Beijing and Shanxi. And that is, that tends to be, it's a sorghum-based Baijiu. It tends to be drier and like a bit like dry, crisp. It's got some floral notes. It has some like herbaceous notes, and it has some fruitiness, but more on the like dried fruit scale. Like I like to think of like apricots as a good tasting note for this. And I would say in the spirits world, it's probably most similar to grappa or like more like grassy mezcal.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. That's a great
Then
comparison.
in Southwest China, strong aroma Baijiu. That can be made either from sorghum or from sorghum blended with other grains. And
Mm-hmm.
there's a very famous style that uses 5-grain mashes. Our distillery uses 100% sorghum mash and like 3-grain like sorghum wheat rice blends as well.
Mm-hmm.
So strong aroma Baijiu is the one that used that continuous fermentation process and the pit fermentation.
Which was the one that we showed on that slide, wasn't it? Yeah.
Right. And
Mm-hmm.
that tends to have 3 like strong notes, like fruity, floral, funky. And
Mm-hmm.
the fruity notes are going to be like pineapple, guava, like a very like tropical fruit note.
Yeah.
And then you've got like an anise note. It's got a very like licorice fennel like taste to it. And then all of them have this umami funkiness that's like kind of similar to like a cheesiness, like almost like a blue cheese or like
Yeah.
a fresh camembert or something. And those 3 flavors might not sound like they would work together, but they complement each other in some really like fun and unusual ways.
No,
And then
I just interrupt. When I've been teaching with strong aroma, it's very interesting how, for me, I'm quite sensitive to some of that funkiness, and I actually quite enjoy it. And I didn't really notice the extent of the fruitiness in there until people kept saying, "I get really fruity aromas. I get really fruity aromas in this," and then you kind of like go back to it and go, "Oh yeah." I mean, these really are amazingly complex and layered spirits.
Mm-hmm. And then the fourth of the major 4, and we're talking here with sauce aroma, and this is a very unusual production process. It uses sorghum mashes, but like the first 2, they ferment and distill them like 8 times. And the first 2 times that they're doing this, they're adding fresh grain into the cycle as with the strong aroma process. But the last 4 to 5 cycles, what they're doing is they're just adding chu. So you're adding no fresh sources of starch. You're just getting every little bit out of that mash. So the flavor as you go gets like increasingly like smoky and umami. And so we think of this as being like the like far end of the umami spectrum, where there's lots of like sesame, chocolate, caramel, mushroom, blue cheese. It's a profoundly like funky spirit that tastes a lot like certain ingredients in the Chinese kitchen, but maybe not so much like other spirits that we're used to drinking. So like the name sauce aroma, in fact, refers to soy sauce. So
Yeah.
that is
And there is, I've always, I mean, but I'm most familiar with Maltai because it's the one you can most easily get in sort of outside of China to a degree. And you do very much get that kind of that sesame oil sort of soy sets of flavors within it. I think it's really, really, really delicious. So, and so they're the four that dominate, aren't they? They account for the bulk of the production, and then the other ones are sort of to a degree variations on a theme. I'm not sure we've got time to necessarily kind of look at those in any great detail here, unfortunately. But
so like the next most like popular or well-known style would be like what they call Phoenix aroma, and I'm not going to get into it too much, but like for example, Phoenix aroma is a sorghum-based baijiu that is fermented in mud pits. But they're using the style of Chu that they use in North China to make light aroma baijiu. And they're also not developing the pits over time. So they clean out the pits every year. So there are variations on, like it's kind of a combination of light and strong aroma baijiu processes. But they also, do unusual things with aging at the end. Like they'll age in like wicker baskets instead of clay jars. So, and like there's another style that's called mixed aroma baijiu that is essentially just a blend of strong and sauce aroma baijius. So, very much these other styles of baijiu are experimenting with the production process and borrowing elements from elsewhere.
Excellent. Okay. So I've just got a few questions that have popped up here. Thank you very much, Lydia, for sharing those. Right. Okay, so this is the volume of the layers the same, or do the volumes of the layers decrease as the pit gets deeper and the contents more yeah. So I think what this Liam was asking here was about the when you're emptying the pit out, I think maybe are these layers uniform, or are they kind of how are they kind of deciding where does one layer end and when does another layer start?
I think that graphic representation might be a little misleading in that respect, that the different layers that you're showing there are different sizes. Whereas in the actual, at the distillery, they're actually taking it out, like a few feet at a time. And it will be the same amount every time as they work their way down the pit.
Okay. So it would be kind of, that they would know that out of this pit, we're going to take, go down so far, that's a layer, go down so far, then that's a layer. And then and that will be the same time after time after time after time.
And there's a couple reasons for that. You can only distill so much at a time, and you don't want to leave this fermented mash just laying around exposed to the elements. And also, that's the basic reason for it. And you also, if you emptied an entire pit out, you would just have this massive pile of grain that wouldn't be very easy to work with.
Yeah, no, absolutely. No, that does make a lot of sense, actually. There is always that thing when you kind of get so far into this game that you realize that there are some very practical decisions that producers have to make. And actually, a lot of the decisions are based on just the raw mechanics of practicality. So there's another question here, which is about inert vessels. Now, the clay vessels will be letting through oxygen, so they will allow oxidation to happen. Has anyone kind of experimented with anything that's kind of more like stainless steel that kind of would be a barrier to that oxidation?
Yeah,
I mean, there are
certainly. So there are. I mentioned that traditionally baijiu is aged in terracotta clay, but there are many distilleries that will age their lower end products typically in large tanks, like you might see at a brewery, just big stainless steel tanks. And oftentimes after you've aged your baijiu for the amount you would like in clay, you will move it to stainless steel so that you can use those valuable clay jars for the next batch.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's that again. That's fair enough. Now, I think, and this I think the most important question of all from Charlie. How are the various styles typically consumed? And how do I mean? I think it's a very relevant question. How do they consume baijiu in China?
So in China, Baijiu is going to be served at dinner time, so or lunchtime. It is viewed as an accompaniment to food, much the way that like grape wine is served with meals in Europe.
Hmm.
So the typical Baijiu glass is tiny little thing. I'm holding one up here.
Hmm.
It's about a third of an ounce. And the reason that they're so small is both Baijiu is often bottled at quite high strengths. I would say 50 to 55% is the average strength of a Baijiu in China.
Sure.
And the way it's consumed is not like sipping while you're drinking the meal, but usually communally. So when you're at the dinner table, usually the host will start the meal by standing up and making a toast to everyone. Everyone lifts their glass and they say "Ganbei," which means dry the glass, and then you shoot it, the whole thing,
Hmm.
and you present it to everyone so they know that it's empty. And you didn't shoot it.
This is
Yeah,
you can't get away with cheating.
and so you usually do like about 3 communal toasts, and then anyone at the table can go up to anyone else at the meal and toast them. And it's reciprocal. So if you get toasted, you're supposed to toast that person back. And if you toast someone, they're supposed to toast you back. And by the end of dinner, if you've done your job right, everyone is
Quite merry.
pretty drunk.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's like a fun communal way. And the other like important thing to note about the fact that it's consumed with food is that the flavor profiles within a baijiu, I pointed out the regions that they come from, like rice aroma from Southeast China, light aroma from North China, sauce and strong aroma from Southwestern China. That's very important because baijiu is part of the dining tradition. The flavors of baijiu complement the regions that create that baijiu very, very well.
Yeah.
So in very real terms, the strong flavors of a baijiu are complementary to the strong flavors of the food of that region.
Yeah.
Then there's one other way that's typical for baijiu to be consumed in China, and that is in more of a medicinal kind of folk infusion way,
Hmm.
where you go to many parts of China, you go to wine shops and you'll see jars of baijiu lined up, sometimes 20, 30 different jars. And each one of them will be infused with something else, whether it's like plums, goji berries, ginseng, sometimes many different combinations of flavor. Sometimes sugar is added. And this originated as medicine, but some people drink these just for, because they like the flavor as well.
No,
Yeah.
no, absolutely. Fair
So
play.
infusion is the way that you add flavor to the baijiu itself in China. But of course, outside of China and in many cities in China today, baijiu is starting to be used as a cocktail ingredient. And
Yeah.
it can be quite challenging because the flavors are unique to baijiu, but some of the results are quite delicious.
Yeah, I've had some things that haven't worked quite so well because you kind of lose this. It's kind of this like what do you do with baijiu, particularly when it's a very powerfully flavored thing. Do you try and work around it, or you just kind of just try and support it and lift it up? And it's I've had some really, really interesting and successful kind of cocktails, but they're just different. And I think that would be one of the kind of the things to kind of potentially push more in the way in kind of in European markets to kind of, well, how do I use this? How do I use this exotic beverage? So I have another question here, which is Ming River available in the UK? So quick plug.
Yes. So at the moment, it is not, but I'm happy to announce here tonight that we have recently decided that we are going to start distributing in UK in September with High Spirits. So
Okay, great.
we're
Yep.
really excited to be working with them, and hopefully you will see it all over the place by the end of the year.
I will certainly be going for it. Now, I think we've gone over the hour, and I think everyone has been very patient to kind of to hang around. So I think we're probably gonna have to wrap this up now because yeah, we've done, I think we've covered a lot of ground. I'd like to say thank you very much, Derek. I think that's been a really, I've enjoyed that conversation, and hopefully other people have enjoyed it too. Lydia's just put up on the screen here all of your various different links, so your website and your various different social media handles as well.
And I would also like to quickly plug, if you want to check out Ming River and what we're doing, Ming River Baijiu is our handle on most social media. mingriver.com, MING, is our website. And check out my new book, Drunken China.
Yes, and may the best man win. Or
indeed,
maybe someone else will. Who knows? We will see. Thank you ever so much for your time, Derek. I really, really appreciate
likewise,
that.
this is a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for tuning in and staying. Okay, thank you all very much.
All right.